Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Fulbright Ukraine's presentation. Today, we have a very important discussion ahead of us, a very difficult one, but this month is a very, difficult but also significant remembrance month for Ukraine and for Ukrainian history and for world history. We are reflecting upon the history of Holodomor, which is recognized as a genocide by many countries in the world, including the United States. And today with us, we have a Fulbright researcher, John Vsetecka from Michigan State University, who is in Ukraine researching all year this year on Fulbright. And the title of his talk today that we're really excited and eager to engage with is Through the Lens of Nikolai Bokan, an intimate history of one family's experience during and after the Holodomor. A little bit more about John Vsetecka is that he is a PhD candidate right now in the Department of History at Michigan State and current Fulbright student scholar, as you know, based in Kyiv. And he is working on his dissertation, which examines the problems left in the wake of the 1932-33 Holodomor in Soviet Ukraine. He's also the founder and current co-editor of HNet Ukraine, which is a fabulous resource. I know firsthand as being part of the team, the commander of HNet Ukraine, that this is quickly becoming the go-to source for information about events, conferences, publications, and all kinds of activities connected to the research of Ukraine on all historical, not only historical, but also other sociological and different interdisciplinary engagements with all periods of Ukraine and Ukrainian history and society. Also would like to mention that this is, converging with the celebration of Thanksgiving in the United States. I find it very significant that this every year in November, we think about the history of genocide in Ukraine, but maybe also if we think about it in the United States context and the story of Thanksgiving, there's a lot of discussion around what Thanksgiving has meant to different populations in the US. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to John and let him share also his visual material that he has prepared for us today, including original archival material that he's been working on here in Ukraine as part of his Fulbright. John.
Yes, great. Thanks so much, Jessica, for the nice introduction. And thanks to everyone else who is tuning into this talk. I know there are many of you that are both locally and internationally, and this is early for my family, who I see is here, that is all the way in Colorado and some in Michigan as well, and on the East Coast. And I really want to thank Fulbright Ukraine for inviting me to give this talk during what is Holodomor Remembrance Week and the 88th anniversary of the famine, if you can believe that. I also want to take this time to give thanks to the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium and Andrei Kohut of the SBU Archive, who is in California right now, ironically, for allowing me to work with these materials before I even got to Ukraine. And I also want to mention that the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium has put much of these materials that I'm going to discuss today up on a website, and we can share that link in a little bit. But if you're interested in learning more about what I talk about this afternoon, you can visit this website and see for yourself some of the photos that I'll share and learn more about the history that the Holodomor team put together in Canada. And it's just, it's really a wonderful resource. So we'll make sure that you can get that link at the end of the talk. So we'll get my presentation up here now so you can see the PowerPoint that I've produced for today. Now, this afternoon, I'm going to share with you some of my current research that is part of my larger dissertation project on the effects of the 1932-33 famine in Soviet Ukraine. And my dissertation is a history of the issues and problems that the famine left in its wake. And I'm particularly interested in those problems that outlasted the event itself. So put another way, just because mass starvation subsided, or largely subsided in 1933, did not mean that the effects of the famine came to an abrupt end. And it's in this period, what I call the aftermath of the famine, that my work takes place. I think they're working on getting that presentation up right now for you. So the story that I will tell today is about the struggles that one family, the Bokan family, faced after losing one of their own. And it's a story of grief, of trauma, and family division that started during the famine, but it's also a story that transcended the event itself. Now, the story of the Bokans drew my interest not only for academic reasons, but for personal ones as well. And I think it's worth me taking a moment here to explain to you why this research matters to me so much and why it came to me at sort of an inopportune time in my life, but also it was also an opportune moment. Let me put it this way. So let me explain this to you. In January of 2019, my family experienced our own form of trauma. And this is when my stepmother, Tracy, passed away unexpectedly from a brain aneurysm. She left behind a husband, kids, family, and friends. And as my own family started this process of grieving and trying to make sense of what happened, I became interested in better understanding how people cope with tragedy, particularly the effects that continue to linger even after the tragedy occurs. Now, this all took place at a crucial moment in my graduate career, and my interest in the aftermath of tragedy conveniently spilled over into my research, as these things do. Our narratives are always personal to at least some degree. Now, during this time, I'm working with my graduate advisor, Matt Pauley, who's in the audience today, and we were working on the specifics of what my dissertation would be on. And at one of our regular coffee meetings, he asked me a question that seemed simple, but was deceptively complex. And he asked me, what happened after the famine? It's a question that started to shape my research topic, and it's honestly a question that has continued to haunt me until this day, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. Now, also at this time, I was taking a graduate seminar on historical trauma, believe it or not, with one of my committee members who works on the aftermath of the terror of the French Revolution. And it was his intellectual prodding that helped guide me to literature on trauma, grief, and the study of aftermaths. And so it's in this moment, all of this kind of coalesces for me and forms what would become my larger dissertation project. With all of this happening simultaneously in 2019, in the spring of 2019, I started to think more critically about what we knew concerning the effects of the famine on those who survived, particularly in the period immediately following the famine. Now, as someone who's worked on researching the Holodomor for a number of years now, I've become increasingly uncomfortable with our tendency to study the famine up until 1933 and then sort of stop. Now, to do this, I think, ignores the numerous effects of the famine that followed. Recent scholarship has started to think along similar lines, but much of it is focused on the longer-term effects of famine through things like intergenerational transmission of trauma and epigenetics, which has provided us with really fantastic research, and it's much needed. There's also been an increase in the study of psychological consequences among the descendants of Holodomor survivors. Scholars such as Victoria Gorbanova and Vitaly Klimchuk have done great work documenting how descendants of Holodomor survivors have adapted their attitudes based on what they went through during the famine. Other studies have documented the trials and tribulations that survivors faced once they were able to get out of Ukraine as well. And we know, for example, that in the 1970s and 1980s, there's just a surplus of testimony that takes place about the famine and the Holocaust and other, genocides and tragedies of the 20th century. But the U.S. Commission on the Ukraine Famine that works in the 1980s really collects, one of the largest mass of survivor testimony outside of Ukraine itself. So we have this information as well. Now, while these works are vitally important to our understanding of the famine's full effects, we still know little about the period immediately following the end of the famine in Soviet Ukraine and what these effects of the famine were. And we know even less about the way that the famine continued to shape and impact people in their lives throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, which generally is when my work takes place. The story of Nikolaibo Khan and his family provides us with some insight into this very issue. And as I will talk about in just a moment, the Bokan family narrative reveals that the famine did indeed play an instrumental role in changing family dynamics after the famine. Not only did the famine take the life of one of Bokan's sons, but it also caused a rift between Bokan and his remaining children that ultimately led to violence, separation, arrest, and even death. So what this tells us is that the famine had powers beyond just the ability to starve people, and this is important. And these powers continued to exert influence in various aspects of people's lives, even after the famine was considered officially over. Now, it is these internal divisions and rifts of the Bokan family that we will examine today. Due to Nikolai Bokan working as a professional photographer throughout his life, he was able to take some of the only photos of the famine currently known to researchers. In addition to capturing the photos of everyday life, he also began to document his own family's grief, division, and their troubles as well. And in doing so, he left behind evidence of life after the famine, which is crucial for us to understand. And with this, we were able to develop a much fuller understanding of the photos thanks to his inscriptions on them, as well as the information that he wrote down in his diary and memoir. His Bokan's journals, photographs, sketches, and other documents in his police file provide us with insight into the ways that the 1932-33 famine shaped and influenced lives for years to come. So now let me turn to their story. The picture that you can see now is Nikolaibo Khan, and he will be our main protagonist for today. Bokan was born in 1881 in Chernihiv Oblast, which is just north here of Kiev. And he became orphaned as a young child after the death of both of his parents, so he had a tragic childhood. His mother died of complications from childbirth, and his father would go on to pass away from an illness that we know was exacerbated by alcoholism. Now, according to Bokan, his father was quite abusive, so when his father passed away, Bokan kind of insinuates that he felt some sort of relief when his father died, so he wouldn't have to kind of endure this, abusive behavior from his father anymore. His father's turn toward alcohol and abuse had a lasting effect on Bokan, I think, and it seems to have played a role in shaping his life philosophy. Later on, Bokan became part of the Tolstoyan movement, which is a religious and social movement based on the philosophical writings of the famed writer Leo Tolstoy. The movement promotes religious teachings, pacifism, vegetarianism, moral improvement, and abstinence from things like alcohol and smoking, among others. It would become a philosophy that Bokan would attempt to push on his children throughout their life. And as you'll see today, it became a major point of contention for his family during the famine, when his children blamed their upbringing on their father and his anti-Soviet sentiments. But more on that in a little bit. Наступний slide, будь ласка. After working a number of jobs in different parts of Ukraine and joining the Red Army for a brief stint, Bokan eventually settled down in his hometown of Baturin, which is in Chernihiv. He married his wife Vasilina, and they had 7 children together. They had 6 sons and 1 daughter, which you can see on this slide. Their children were Nikolai Jr., Vladimir, Boris, Konstantin, Lev, Alexander, and Anna. For a time, the family lived together in their house in Baturin. The children were homeschooled and taught under the Tolstoyan philosophy that Bokan attempted to project on them. Although Bokan was at one time a Bolshevik sympathizer in his early days, he no longer believed in the cause. He was especially angered by their anti-religious sentiments, which challenged his own set of beliefs that he had come to take under the Tolstoyan movement. Bokan thought that by homeschooling his kids, he could shield them from the Soviet system that he had come to resent. Later in life, as I mentioned before, his children would accuse their father of depriving them of opportunities in the Soviet system due to their homeschooling and lack of formal education. So they had felt wronged by their father, and they felt stymied in the fact that they couldn't move on in life and join the Soviet system in any kind of meaningful way. They thought was due to the way that they were brought up by their father. Now, however, the unfolding of the famine in Soviet Ukraine in 1932-33 is really what begins to insert this division into the family. Next slide, please. In 1932, during the time of the famine, наступний slide, будь ласка. So in 1932, during the time of the famine, the Bokan family struggled to eat. And like so many others, they had difficulty obtaining enough food to survive. Although Bokan's oldest son, Nikolai, was not living with them at the time, the family still had a lot of people under their roof, and the resources they had went quickly. So as a result, Nikolai's oldest son, Vladimir, was asked to leave their home in June of 1932, and he was asked to find employment so that he could support himself. Now, this is important because Vladimir had never left the home before, and when he was younger, he sustained some type of injury to his eye, which his father said he used as an excuse to be kind of lazy and not work and do things in life. And this was the reason that this is one of the reasons that Vladimir kind of stayed around the Bokan residence. But his injury was serious, at least from what we can tell. But Bokan believed, according to his documents, that it wasn't serious enough for Vladimir to avoid life's responsibilities. The famine changed all of this, and times were desperate enough that Vladimir was asked by his parents to find a job and support himself. Now you can see in this slide, they're saying goodbye to Vladimir before he leaves the Bokan residence, and we'll see other images of some of his other kids leaving later on, and this became kind of a tradition that Bokan would do, is he would photograph those who were leaving the Bokan residence as kind of a memory and as a goodbye. Next slide, please. Now, Vladimir did not take to being kicked out of the house very well, and the result of this was tenuous, and Nikolai and his son's relationship became strained as a result. In response to being kicked out, Vladimir threatened to return home and burn down the house. Now, you can see in this image on the far right that Bokan and one of his sons are preparing buckets of water in case that Vladimir decides to carry out the threat. So they're filling up pails with water and putting them next to the house should Vladimir return and actually set it on fire. Now, this doesn't happen, but they're preparing for the worst. Now, several months later, though, Vladimir does return and he vandalizes the family home. He breaks several window panes and causes other damage. And in this middle photo, you can see some of the window panes that were broken and some of the temporary fixes to replace the glass that are there. But while these photos show us the physical destruction that was taking place, it's important to note that they also give us insight into the internal destruction of the family that was starting to take shape. Now, what these images reveal is that the famine, as a sort of backdrop to the family drama, was beginning to drive wedges between the members of the Bokan family. As the famine conditions grew worse, so did the state of family affairs. With even less to eat than before, Bokan arranged for his daughter Anna to go and live with a neighbor where she would be able to work for some food. And this was another way to get her out of the house so they would have one less mouth to feed. But this arrangement did not last long, and it turned out that where Anna was working, she was actually only getting fed some water and maybe a little bit of milk and not the food that the neighbor had promised. So this agreement was cut short and Anna was brought back into the Bokan residence where again, the family had to absorb another one of their children under their roof, and they had very little resources, so it put a continued strain on the family during this time. At the same time, Bokan's third oldest son, Boris, who you can see on the right here, he returned home after serving a prison sentence for not joining the Red Army. Although most of Bokan's children did not believe in the Tolstoyan beliefs that Bokan did, Boris seemed to entertain this for a little while, at least, and he had pacifist views which explain him not joining the army. So he served a prison sentence, but then returns home in March of 1933. Now, for those of you familiar with the trajectory of the famine, this is in the spring of 1933 when the famine is at its worst. It's the height of the famine. Tens of thousands of people are dying every day. So while the family likely, was happy to have their son home, it put another strain on the family and their resources. When Boris returned home, he worked with his father and he assisted him with his photography business. And they would work together until they were both arrested in 1937, which I'll get to in a little while. It was then that Boris would go on to renounce his father and his father's Tolstoyan beliefs during their criminal trial in 1938. Next slide, please. So when Boris returns home in March of 1933, the household is facing the fact that their supplies are running out and they don't have enough to eat, and they haven't been able to feed everyone in their family with proper nutrients. And this is happening to most people at this time. We just have photo evidence of this particular family. And although two of Nikolai's sons were away and not living with them, it turned out that there were still too many mouths to feed. So, much like his older brothers before him, Constantine, or Costia as he's referred to, and I will use Costia throughout this presentation, but it is in reference to Constantine. He was another one of Nikolai's sons, and he is asked to depart the Bokan house. Now, it's unclear whether Costia was asked to leave or if he left on his own volition. We don't have a clear answer to this. But either way, it became apparent to one of them, either the parents or to Costia, that someone in the house needed to go. And the fact that he was in his early 20s at this point, he needed to go and make a living for himself and take a little bit of pressure off of the family. So, and you can see a picture of Costia here, and then this the middle photo shows a picture that Bokan took in April of 1933, where they hadn't had bread for over 300 days. So they're they're living on very little at this point, and this photo documents that. When Costia left the family residence, he found work on a nearby collective farm. His father disapproved of such work because it exposed Costia to a system of beliefs that stood in opposition to those of the Tolstoyan ones that he believed. But it seems apparent that what bothered Nikolai more was his son's absorption into the collective farm system, which he tried to prevent but eventually could not due to the pressures of the famine, restricting how much he could provide for his family. Now, it would prove to be a lasting guilt that Nikolai would contend with for the rest of his life, and we'll talk about this here in a few minutes. Costia's time on the collective farm exposed him to a number of new ideas and thoughts that he had not been able to learn at home, and he started to challenge his upbringing and distance himself from his father. But on the collective farm, things were also not great, and Costia became overworked and he was barely fed. His supervisor encouraged him to start smoking cigarettes, and he told him that smoking would help to suppress the feelings of hunger that he was experiencing. So in this way, right, Costia begins to ingest, both mentally and physically, all of the things that had been off limits to him at home under his parents' supervision. But this all turned out to be too much. Now, in June 1933, after many months of malnourishment and labor-intensive work that he did on the collective farm, Costia collapsed in the field and died. Next slide, please. Now, the death of Costia marked a rupture in his father's life. Nikolai, his dad, had had quarrels and disagreements with his children over the years, but the death of a child was something new entirely. For reasons still somewhat unknown, Costia's death made Nikolai pick up his camera and photograph and document his son's death, funeral, and burial. Now, he's a photographer, so it's not surprising that he would take pictures, but to capture the moments of death like this is pretty incredible. And the photographs were evidence of the famine's significant toll, but they also cemented the fact that Costia was gone. And the photos were, as one scholar has put it, insurance against forgetting. Now, in doing this, Bokan captured the trauma of loss, and he captured his own family's trauma in the process. Judith Herman, who is a medical scholar of trauma and somebody who influences my own work a great deal, she says, quote, that traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. They confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror, and evoke the responses of catastrophe. The photographs that Bokan took were markers of the famine's consequences, but the photos were also something tangible to hold on to, as the life of his son was no longer within his grasp. The photos that Bokan took of his deceased son and his funeral, which I will show in just a second, provide us with a really intimate view into the ways that the Bokan family grieved and said goodbye to one of their own. Now, just a warning before we show you these pictures that they might be unsettling to some. So, if you're uncomfortable with kind of viewing these images of Costia's death and his funeral, please feel free to look away. Next slide, please. Bokan's pictures provide us with some of the only photographic evidence concerning the way that families mourned loss and remembered those who died as a result of the famine. Here, I will show you some of the photos from Costia's funeral and offer a few remarks on them. The photo that you see here on the left shows a deceased Costia lying in his coffin prior to being buried. Unlike so many others who died during the famine and were buried in mass graves or in makeshift graves without proper burials or funerals, Costia was allotted something more proper. And due to the fact that he worked close to home, his family was able to say, a more proper goodbye than many others received during this time. The second photo here shows Costia's funeral procession, and these photos that we have are a bit grainy, so they're hard to make out. It's unclear who's in this photo, but it seems to me from the pictures and observing this file and from what we know, it's his family, his mother, his father, and the siblings that were around the house. And it's also relevant to note that the coffin is being pulled by a wagon and horse, which indicates that the body was taken away from the Bokan residency to a nearby cemetery. This too was not always possible during the famine, when many families were forced to bury their loved ones outside of traditional cemeteries due to them being overfilled or inaccessible. At times, authorities banned people from burying the deceased there. So while we might not think much of a traditional funeral for someone who died, we have to remember that a proper burial was often a luxury during this time. Next photo, please. The pictures of Costia's burial are also revealing. In the image on the left, we see Nikolai standing next to the grave of his son. Notably, several fresh graves appear to surround Costia's, which tells us that many others were dying too. It is also worth noting that Costia's grave stands out among the rest due to his grave marker, which is the sort of focal point of these photos, right? This kind of tall, long white stick with the grave marker up top stands in isolation among the other graves. Now, if you look closely at the photos, you will notice some long branches that are stuck in the ground in the graves kind of next to Costia's and behind. And these are makeshift grave markers that people would put in the ground to denote, where someone was buried. And there wasn't a lot of supplies or energy or time to make these kinds of, headstones and memorials that we're accustomed to today. So these branches became makeshift grave markers that people would use to be able to find the ones that they buried. But Costia's obviously sticks out. On Costia's grave marker, there's a small blurb, and I'll read it to you. It says, Konstantin Nikolaevich Bokan died on June 30th, 1933, in a field from overwork on the collective farm and from malnutrition. So in a time when the Soviets are officially denying that a famine was taking place and have, still deny that a famine took place, the grave marker stood as a public rebuke of the official narrative and confirmed that people were indeed dying of famine-related causes. To me, the grave marker is symbolic. It acts simultaneously as a memorial to Costia, but also as a criticism of the system and conditions that took Costia's life. And we don't have any more information on this of how long the grave marker was allowed to stand. Because it mentions specifically that Costia died of famine, this would have been, you couldn't say these things in public at the time. So it's possible that it was vandalized, destroyed, or taken down by authorities, but we don't have any information on that. We would only be able to speculate. Next slide, please. So the loss of loved ones was commonplace during the famine, and we know that people suffered and grieved. However, we know very little about what this grieving actually looked like or what it involved. How did people try and make sense of the famine? How did they honor the memory of those that they lost? And how did people try and how did they, and what effects did this have on those who survived, right? These are the questions that remain and ones that I think about a lot. But we have pictures from Bokan's collection that help to answer some of these questions. Now, in this picture on your screen, Nikolai sits with 3 of his sons at the dining room table in their house. And in the middle of them is this kind of memory board, and it's nicely framed and it's adorned with flowers at the top, and it shows 5 photos of Costia's death. This memory board, I think it's important to note, is not in the file. The photo is the only evidence of this memory board that we have. And as such, the top photo on the board and much of the writing is illegible and we can't make it out. But the other photos on the board are found elsewhere in Bokan's file, and they are the ones that I showed you previously. Now, I've worked with a few digital enhancement tools, and I've been trying to zoom in on this to figure out what that top photo is. And it's very hard to make out. I haven't been able to come to a definitive answer, but from some work I've been doing this week, it seems that the top photo it looks the way that Bokan is sitting, it looks like it might be a photo of him holding Costia as a baby, just the way that he's sitting and the way that his hands are, output. But I have reservations about this theory because the whole board is about Costia's death. So one photo of Costia alive as a baby would sort of stand in opposition to the other photos that are on the board. So I hope that at some point somebody's able to kind of enhance this image and be able to look at that board more closely to see what it says and see what that top photo is all about. Nonetheless, the photo display board was made in memory of Costia, and the picture shows the family mourning next to it. So this tells us a few things, and it tells us that the Bokan family started to commemorate Costia immediately after he died. The display featuring Costia's death from the famine in 1933 would be the first in a series of display boards that Nikolai would create up until his arrest in 1937. So after Costia's death, Nikolai creates several more photo display boards that detailed what he viewed to be the reasons for the family's disintegration. And an example from November 1935 highlights this well. Next slide, please. So in 1935, this is in November, this is 2 years after Costia died and about 2 years after the famine had come to an end. And this is one of many boards that he would create. But this specific one, which laments his sons for rejecting their Christian upbringing and getting involved with the wrong type of crowd, or so Bokan believed, provides short descriptions of Nikolai Jr., Vladimir, and Konstantin, so 3 of his sons. The short paragraphs that Bokan wrote blame his sons for their work ethic, immoral behaviors, and aversion to Christianity as the reasons for their failures and shortcomings in life. Now, although there is not a photo of Costia on this board, the son who died, there is a description written about him below the pictures of his 2 brothers. Now, it is in these descriptions written by Bokan that we start to see the stages of grief emerge. And for me, at least, it is these descriptions and writings that seem more important to me than the photos. Now, the photos, are kind of this visual shock, but as a historian, I'm interested in the narratives behind the photos. And, very luckily, we have these, and Bokan, jotted down some of his thoughts about this stuff. So we are able to understand what happened, at least from his point of view. So in his writings on this thing, Bokan, he states that, quote, during the famine of 33, he means Costia, renounced his father, who had no opportunity to give him extra food, and he paid for it with his life. Now, it seems important to me here that Bokan writes about his inability to provide for his son at such a vulnerable moment in his life. I read this excerpt written by him as one of an admission of guilt. And he gestures to the fact that Costia might still be alive if he had been able to provide food for him and keeping, and allowed him to live at home and not go work on the collective farm. And for those familiar with the stages of grief, Bokan also starts to exhibit some features of what is called the anger and bargaining stage. On the same photo board, he writes about Costia, quote, that he was hardworking and kind, but weak-minded. Now, these types of statements are important, I think, because they reflect Bokan's effort to negotiate the memory of his son. He first compliments Costia by referring to his work ethic, but he switches gears to criticize him for being weak-minded. And through these types of writings and statements that Bokan has, we can see Bokan wrestling with the details of how to remember his son and how to categorize what went wrong. And it's an attempt to find where to place blame, and this will be a problem that Bokan will face for the rest of his life. At the bottom of the board, he continues this kind of bargaining stage of grief, I would argue, where he tries to influence the outcome of his remaining children. So this is another aspect of, kind of trauma and grief. It's trying to control what you can and influence a change in your direction. And he writes an inscription, and it says, quote, I advise my 4 children to leave the primitive pagan public religion and to instead embrace Christianity. In doing so, you will not suffer the fate of your morally bereft brothers. Now, these words represented Nikolai's efforts to make up for the past wrongs by offering the only thing that he could, which was his advice. He hoped that by appealing to them and by outlining what went wrong, maybe they would listen. Next slide, please. Bokan would continue to produce these photos in 1936 and 1937. And in one he created in 1936, which you can see here, he claims that his family is suffering senselessly, like so many others in the world. The boards he produced continued to act as his kind of artistic outlet for figuring out what had gone wrong with his family. While continuing to blame the ills of society for much of his problems, he also starts to direct his anger and frustration in 1936 towards his wife, Vasilina, who you can see here. And this board's, it's interesting for a lot of reasons, but as you can see, he kind of crosses out the members of his family who have died, which is Costia, or the others who are, gone and doing things that he doesn't approve of. So the photos that we can, see their faces, it's Bokan, his wife, and his son Boris, who's working as his assistant at this time. Now, in the photo display board that you can see, he writes, the probable cause is heredity from their mother's side, of which he accuses his wife's family now of being part of the wrong religious environment that suppressed what he called religious self-consciousness. Again, I see this as an attempt to place blame. And still in 1936, Bokan is trying to figure out how to reconcile the death of his son and the lives of his remaining children. And so, in some of his other boards that you saw previous to this and ones that, I won't have time to show today, he's blaming the Soviet system, he's blaming, the anti-religious sentiments. But 3 years after Costia's death, he starts to turn on his own family that's living with him, and now his wife is among them. Next slide, please. So, although Nikolai addressed a number of issues in these display boards, the 1933 famine and the death of Costia continued to be featured prominently in almost every photo board that he would come to make. Now, the death of his son, no doubt, was the worst outcome that a parent could face. Pictures of Costia's lifeless body that continued to be put on these display boards meant that Nikolai kept returning to the moment where he lost his son. These photos on the slide are taken from a number of other photo boards that Nikolai created to show you how he kept coming back to Costia's death. So I've taken some screenshots of the files from other display boards, and these are images that you've seen earlier in the presentation. But he keeps drawing on these, and he keeps coming back to them, and he keeps putting them on different boards. And it's this moment that he keeps returning to Costia's death. So what we know from scholarship on trauma and from studying, trauma from the medical side of things too, is that people suffering from it often try to return back in time. They like to go to the moment before the trauma happened, which we know is impossible, but the attempts to do so are part of the traumatic experience itself. The understanding that one cannot go back in time and change the outcome is part of coming to terms with what happened. And in this way, the trauma never really goes away. It's more that people learn how to cope, understand, and continue on with their lives while this trauma is pervasive. Now, unfortunately, it seems that Bokan was never able to really process the death of his son. In one of his last display boards that he created in October of 1937, the same month that he would be arrested, he wrote down some of the last words that Costia spoke to him before leaving for the collective farm. He claims on one of his boards that Costia said, quote, "I will be fed and clothed by strangers. And when I manage to get a lot of money, I won't give a grain to my father." The words by Costia, which under normal circumstances might be attributed to youthful rebellion or father-son disagreements or other, normal, family problems that might be occurring, these continued to haunt Nikolai. And it seems that he kept returning to Costia's death through these photo display boards in an attempt to find answers. But from what we know, Nikolai never found them. Next slide, please. While continuing to work through this trauma that came with Costia's premature death, Nikolai faced perpetual backlash from his remaining children. The appeals that he made in these display boards for them to turn around their lives, they fell on mostly deaf ears. And in 1936, 3 of his children, Alexander, Lev, and Anna, moved out of the family home and into a place of their own where the 3 of them would live together. Struggling to make money and find food, the siblings resorted to stealing from their father. They took money, photography equipment, clothes, and other goods from their parents' house, and they sold them for food. This sketch here, which was done either by Nikolai or his son Boris, I think I cut it off the picture, of course, but I think actually Boris's signatures in the far right corner of this. Either way, the sketch shows 3 younger kids hauling away the stolen goods from the Bokan residence and taking them. So it's kind of an interesting, memorial piece to this event. When Nikolai reported the stolen goods to authorities, they paid no attention to him and offered him no help. The authorities even applauded the children for rejecting their father's religious doctrine and stealing from him. So despite his best efforts to change the course of his children's lives, Nikolai fell short. And it's important to note, during the 30s especially, and during the time of the famine, it was really common for authorities to try and turn children on their parents and on their families. They would, they would offer them food or candies or various things in order to turn in their family for either hoarding grain or foods or other goods that were supposed to be turned over to the state. So the fact that this is happening in 1936, that his children are kind of working against him, this is happening in kind of a larger sphere that's going on in the Soviet Union at this time. Next slide, please. In October of 1937, Nikolai and his son Boris were arrested and charged with spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. Now, thinking about this now and knowing what we do about the Soviet Union, it's sort of incredible that Nikolai wasn't arrested earlier for taking these photos. He was a photographer, so he probably got away with being able to document things in certain ways, by flying under the radar, but it's still amazing that it took until 1937 for him to be arrested. And his case is actually just one of many criminal files of people who are convicted in 1937, what is the beginning of the Great Terror, for things that had to do with the 1932-33 famine. His is just one case. But I think his case is really important, not only for the images, because it gives us a much longer and much more in-depth family history. So I've chosen to focus on this here. According to the documents in the file, it seems that he did show these display boards to people in town, but we don't have much information on how he did this or what the reception of the photos was among those who saw them. I'm not sure where he would have posted them, if he put them outside of his house, or how that would have worked. But I would be inclined to think that the only reason for him to show these publicly would be to kind of publicly shame his children into maybe submitting to some kind of obedience. I'm not sure, it's just a guess, but we do know that people did see these, and it was probably because of their public display in some capacity that he was arrested for these. The pictures that he took over the years became admissible evidence against him during his trial in 1938. And they are likely the reason that his appeal was rejected. So he was sentenced, he and Boris were sentenced, they appealed, but it wasn't given a second look at all. And I think probably because this photo evidence was too damning. To make matters worse for Nikolai, several of his children testified against him during his trial, so the problems continued. And one of the children to testify against him is Boris, who had been his assistant up until their arrest. And at this point, Boris sort of denounces his father and his Tolstoyan beliefs, and it's likely that he's doing this in a last-ditch effort to save himself, but it didn't work. After the trial, Nikolai and Boris both are sentenced to hard labor in camps across the Soviet Union. Boris would go on to die in 1939, and Nikolai would follow in 1942. The fate of the remaining Bokan family members is unknown. So let me conclude here with just a few thoughts about the significance of this story in light of the 88th anniversary of the famine that is taking place this week. And it's really great to finally be here in Kiev to be a part of this commemoration. The story of the Bokan family and the photographs, associated with them give us incredible insight into the way that one family's underlying issues revolving around religion, values, and generational antagonisms were exacerbated by the 1932-33 famine. It is often difficult to remember that people had normal, everyday difficulties that existed outside of the famine's sphere of influence. But the Bokan story helps us to remember that this was true. We think of the famine as totalizing in all capacities, but people did have issues that were not always famine related. But at the same time, the story tells us a great deal about the ability of the famine to find its way into personal matters and compound the existing problems while also creating new ones. Furthermore, the story is a reminder that there were many effects of the famine that outlasted the event itself. And we see this through Bokan reconciling with his son's death caused by famine, in 1933, 34, 35, 36, and 37. And it probably happened even after he was arrested and sent to the camps. We just don't have any documentation of this. The family problems, they're just one example, I think, of these lasting effects, but they're useful as we seek to learn more about the way that individuals and society confronted the effects of the famine in its aftermath. And the famine left a number of problems in its wake that continue to reverberate throughout Ukraine and beyond, actually. And it is useful to comprehend these because they tell us a great deal about the event itself. Now, additionally, the Bokan story encourages us to understand that the 1932-33 famine's effects were comprised of more than starvation alone. The famine did not just starve people. It did other things, as we've learned. Displacement, disease, fear, homelessness, illness, trauma, and family division were just some of the repercussions that followed. And I write about some of these in other parts of my dissertation. As such, stories like the Bokans encourage us to broaden our understanding of the impact of the famine on Ukraine and Ukrainians. So as we commemorate the Holodomor this week and pay our respects, it seems pertinent to me that we return to those who survived and listen to their voices. We still have a great deal to learn about the consequences of the Holodomor, many of which are still with us today. So with that, I want to thank you for attending this talk today. I appreciate you taking the time to come and hear me speak and learn more about the Bokan family, and especially to those of you who are tuning in at early hours in the US and on the eve of Thanksgiving, no less. I appreciate you being here. So thanks so much, and have a great holiday to those who are celebrating tomorrow.
Thank you, John, for your incredibly enriching discussion. I see hands up in the audience, clapping or waving to ask questions. Matt Polly, did you have a question that you would like to ask? Also, feel free to put anything in the chat, but since you're here with us, go ahead.
Oh, I'm going to hold off and see if other people have questions. I was just clapping to mark the end of the presentation, but I have plenty of questions I can ask John, but I'm his advisor, so I probably should let others have first go. Thank you.
Is there anybody else in the audience who would like to pose a question or a comment? Let's see. Anybody? Matt, it looks like you have an opportunity to break the ice.
Well, very good. Then a couple of things. John, an incredibly rich story, isn't it? I mean, these are just really enviable sources. I am struck by a couple of things. That is that this isn't an ordinary father, right? And not in any way, I would suggest, just sort of an amateur photographer. I mean, he's documenting the family's history through this trauma, I suppose in the way that he knows how, but there is absolutely a sort of disciplinarian gaze to his own family dynamics that his children must have reacted to. So to me, I guess one question is, can you tell us anything? I mean, it's hard, obviously, to read these interrogation scripts, but can you tell us something more about how the children were reacting to their father's tutelage? I mean, Costia's anger to me makes sense in a way, right? They are marginalized from Soviet society by their father's own decision to keep them in this sort of insular world, to be homeschooled. And the Soviet system is designed to reward those who are actively participating in it. So that's, I guess, the first question, a bit more about the children's perspective to the extent that you can glean it. And then I was struck by the way that these sort of, I forget how you phrased it, but these sort of memory boards, the boards of the photographs together with the descriptions that the father offers, these seem to me somewhat of a mimicry of Stin Hazeti, that the Soviets were producing for public consumption in any sort of institution, but also in Soviet schools as well. So, you know, as much as he stands in opposition to Soviet cultural norms and Soviet lessons, to me, there's a sort of, as I say, mimicry or participation within the modalities, with the modalities that the Soviet system is using to educate its citizens as well. I'll leave it there. Thanks, John. Very good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so these are great questions. You know, I think now the problem with this source space, and there are many, is the fact that everything is through Bokan's perspective. And we don't get the reactions of Vasilina, who is an understated character in all of this, but plays a really significant role, his wife. And we don't know much about her. But we do know a little bit more about the kids and their reactions to what's happening. And I agree that most of them, I think, are rightfully angry at their father for, you know, asking them to leave. Like, they are asked to leave the house, and he's not providing any kind of opportunity for them. He's just saying, get out, find a job, support yourself. And so there is this backlash, and it's hard to kind of understand, you know, the levels of this resentment, because on the one hand, they, you know, at some point when they're growing up, they're teenagers and young adults, and they, you know, some of us, you know, people rebel against their parents at some stage. So some of this is natural. And then you have this really strict disciplinarian attitude, as you called it, from the Tolstoyan movement, and also from, I think, Bokan's past, particularly his father, that's super harsh to live under. And this kind of religious dogma that they're put under is just something that they don't want. And they see it, I think, rightly so, as kind of prohibitive, because they are not allowed to go to school. They're homeschooled. And so he writes in other display boards about his children's desire for these kinds of material items in life. They want money and jobs. And he says that they come to resent him because he is the reason that they are not allowed to have these things. They can't get a salary. And basically, they see it as not being able to join the Soviet future. He writes about this in one of his display boards. So we know that his reactions, I mean, some of his children's reactions are justified, and they go even further to steal. And they also testify against him in his, you know, his court case, which I think says a lot. Now, to what degree they were kind of forced to do this by the authorities, we don't know, but nonetheless, they were there. And, you know, this mimicry of the Soviet system through his photography, it's interesting. He was a photographer when he was in the Red Army briefly in Romania. So he probably did learn these kinds of methods, not only from the education system, but from his time in the military. And I'm sure some of that transferred over into his work and into his photography and business. And he was a professional photographer. I mean, he did have a small studio in his home, from what we know. You know, some of the documents in the file show his film cases. And really interestingly, actually, we know that he was hired to take photos, because in other memory boards that I didn't share today, there are photos. He has one that is, I think, like 20 or 30 photos of all deceased people. And Costia is on that board, but there's a number of others. And he puts these descriptions on there. And, you know, like some of them is a picture of Tolstoy. And I think there's even a picture of Gandhi on one, you know, maybe not dead at that point, but he had lots of pictures of Gandhi as well. But one of them that stuck out to me is there's this lady who, I forget her name and her age, but she looks like she might be 70 or 80. But according to his description, she's only like 50 years old. So you can see through this picture that, and this is during the famine, that she looks, you know, pretty haggard and beat up from malnourishment and not eating. Now, the description says that she died of suffocation due to gas trying to steal food from mice that had stolen food from her. So to me, he's also documenting that other people died during the famine, not just Costia. He spends the most time on him, of course. But this kind of mimicry, I think, is played out in kind of, you know, taking the system and then mocking it in a sense and saying, you're educating us, and here I am using your same methods. And if you look closely, I'm showing you that your system is killing these people, not just my son, but this lady. And it's the only one on the board. Oh, I'm sorry. She has two children that also, it just says, died by the same cause. So we're led to believe that in their search for food, this mother and her two children died as a result of the famine. And I think he uses these kind of poignantly to show the system, to mock it in kind of this clever way, really, but also to show that what is this education to us? What does it mean? And it means something very different to him than it does to the Soviet system. And it means something completely different to his children than it does to him, and so on. So, yeah, thank you.
Any other comments, questions, observations?
There's one in the chat, Jessica.
Oh, great. Yep. If you want to let me see. Here, I will read it. Sophia Isaev asks, was Nikolai at any time as a local photographer asked to take photos for the authorities?
Yeah. Hi, Sophia. Thanks for your question. It's nice to see you again. As far as I know, he was not asked to take photos by the authorities, except for when he was in the army, and he did a brief stint with them. So, he would have just done some basic photography stuff there. And he writes about kind of being happy that he was a photographer. So, he could kind of continue his pacifist views and not have to take up arms. But I don't think that he ever took photos for the authorities. And if he did, we don't have any record of those photos, and there are none in his file. But what's really interesting, actually, is when you read the file description, the authorities confiscated more photos than are actually in his file. So they seem to have destroyed some, and we can theorize about why they did this, but I'm sure that they were damning to some major degree. And there are lots of questions that remain, which is kind of interesting, because this is one of the more full files that we will find. Working in these archives, you work with pieces a lot and have to put together a lot more than we've had to do with this file. But even with this amount of material, we still have a lot of questions. And someone asked me too about this a while ago, speaking of authorities, if they wondered if the authorities had framed Bokan and put these together themselves, to kind of indict him. But I don't think so, because he did these for years. And I think that if they wanted to arrest him earlier, they could have. And certainly in 1937, he's among a much larger group of people that are arrested for things to do with the famine. And these people are arrested and killed on far less charges and with far less evidence. So I don't see any reason why that would have been the case. But I thought I would just point that out.
We have another question in the chat, this time from Mehmet Volkan. He says, thank you, John. I have a broader question. Do you think that it is really possible to differentiate trauma of the famine from a general trauma of Stalinism? In this case, you certainly do it, but whenever I read studies on the trauma of the famine, mostly but not exclusively the Ukrainian case, these studies read like studies on trauma of Stalinism, where the terror, gulags, or everyday repression dominate, with occasional references to attitudes toward food.
Yeah, thanks for the great question. It's an important one, I think. I think certainly you can make the case, and I do make the case in this chapter that I'm writing on Bokan, that this is about the famine, but not only. And again, I think we have to be cautious, because the famine, it was overwhelming, but at points it's not always totalizing either. I mean, people do have things that happen that are not caused by the famine or because of the famine, but I think the famine plays an important role in exacerbating these types of things. And in the case here, we have specific evidence that says Costia dies, from basically starvation and famine's effects. And this continues to be a point of trauma, but it's one point of trauma. And I think that this is what's important to note. It's not the whole trauma here, as I pointed out. I mean, there are family divisions that are taking place. There's, obviously going to be some resentment of Nikolai not being able to raise his kids in a way that he saw fit. So he's struggling with the others as well. But I would make the case and make the argument that Costia's death is the major rupture here, and that rupture is caused by the famine. So yes, I think that we can see that trauma is specifically caused by the famine, which, is part of a broader, it's under the broader umbrella here of Stalinism, of course. But, I think it's important to be careful with how we mark these things. And, Stalinism was comprised of many things, one of which was the famine. And here I think it plays an important role. So yeah, thanks for that great question.
Any additional questions? I guess I have also a question, maybe for younger researchers who are out there starting out writing their dissertations or shaping a historiography. So much has been written about Holodomor. It's one of the largest and most important topics pertaining to Ukraine. I also think about history of Chernobyl being another one of these important sites for global research. And sometimes maybe it can feel overwhelming where to begin or how to even approach such a topic with so much already out there published. And I was wondering if you have any insights to your process that you can share. I know your advisors here, so maybe not all insights, but how do you, because you do such a great job in this presentation that you shared with us, showing us characters, showing us real lives without turning them into types or archetypes or simple heroes and victims or categories, yet they are representative of their time. This is only one family, but through their story, we learn about so many. How did you select this family to talk about? Because certainly you've seen many stories as you were working through the archives. And what is your process or approach as a writer in going into a field with such a big history and illuminating these voices that are really not small or insignificant? But I guess it's a question about your method and selection. How did you select Bokan family?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Those are great questions. Well, I'll start with that. I'll start with the second part, which is how I selected the Bokan family, which is it came about on accident and because of the availability of the source. Like I mentioned earlier, the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium has created this website, and I believe one of the creators, Anastasia, is here, Leszczyszyn. She was one of the people who put together this file that was found sometime in the 2000s in the Chernihiv archive, which was then transferred to Kiev, which Andrei Kohut got a hold of, and the Holodomor Research Education Consortium, HREC, got a hold of. And they did this wonderful website that put up some of these photographs and started to tell the story. And I went through the website and was looking at the photos, and I wanted to know more. And I was provided with access to the case file, and then quickly realized that this case file is one among many, which I'm still working through, actually. Like I'll be back in the SBU archive next week to tell you more of my findings. But this, as a historian, I follow the paper trail. And because of the availability and the access to sources, which this one is a gold mine, depending on what you're looking for, it's important for me that it's not just the shock value of the photos, which we can talk about. And, for those of you who have read like Wendy Lauer's new book, The Ravine, right, which is all about taking a photograph and working historically backwards from this. These types of things are really interesting. And this, I was kind of inspired by these photographs, but I'm actually less interested in the photographs and more in the descriptions behind them, which is what I'm working on. And so that's how I came into the Bokan family. And for me, they're symbolic in the sense that they represent, I think, the trials and tribulations that so many others, the millions of people who suffered, were going through. Now, some of the details they're a bit unique. Not everyone is a photographer, not everyone belonged to the Tolstoyan philosophy. These types of things are unique. But I think the general suffering and sentiment and, the process of grieving and mourning and trying to remember those who died, I push back against that narrative that it's marked by silence. And this shows that it wasn't. People were not silent. Maybe they were private, but they weren't silent. So I think this is an important characteristic that kind of drew me in. Now, as for my method, this is something that, is continuing to evolve. I'm still writing the dissertation. I'm still researching. And, I have always been interested in the Holodomor precisely because I saw what I thought was lacking, which was the people's voices. So when I heard my first lecture on the Holodomor as an undergraduate student in a lecture by Steven Siegel, I'll tell you this, I felt I felt dumb and I felt embarrassed. I'd never heard of this before. Millions of people had died. I wanted to know more. And look where I am now. I wrote an undergraduate thesis on this, an MA thesis, but that work back then was really focused on survivor testimony. And so the more I think about it, I've always been interested in the voices of the people. Now, this isn't to say that the debates going on right now, specifically, over the death toll, which they are having conferences in Kiev about now. I'm not saying that these aren't important, but I think often, let me put it this way, I'm more interested in the people behind the numbers. And I'm interested in extracting their stories as best as I can from the documents that we have and telling kind of the human condition about what happened. And there has been a lot written about the Holodomor, you're right. And this is where I kind of have my interjection in the historiography, as we call it, what's missing from the literature. And for me, it's that, the famine doesn't just go away in 33. Maybe starvation does, but the effects of it don't. And, I write about too in a different chapter about the international reverberations of these effects, right? The fear that a future famine is coming is something that haunts those who actually are working in humanitarian organizations. And if you look at their documents closely, this is going on through 1934, 1935, and the famine's talked about a great deal in this way. And so it's these kinds of effects, the things that are happening after the famine kind of hits and is at its peak. Like after it peaks, what happens? What are the problems that remain? And this is what I'm here in Kiev to write about. So I've given you a little taste of what I'm working on, and I still have much more to do here in the remaining months. But yeah, thanks for that great question. And I'll also point out too that if there are students in the audience that are interested in this type of thing, like get in touch with me. I'm happy to, talk more about this off screen and, give you insight and resources into what I think needs to be done further for the study of the Holodomor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've also done a really great job writing about visual culture in an interdisciplinary sense. You're also working with visual material and aesthetics of history, and Anastasia Vsetecka, if she's listening, was in my course at University of Toronto on visual culture, and we visited the Holodomor archive at Hrek together, and we were looking at all the photographs there, and I know that she has worked extensively on the photo archive there. So that's also a great resource for anybody who's listening. It's a rather new archive, and it's waiting to be written about. So yeah, I think that you're doing something new also, even though there is a lot written about Holodomor, I don't think there is a lot written about the visual evidence that exists, or the material that has been collected. Are there others who want to ask questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand virtually? No? Matthew, Dr. Polly.
No worries. I just thought I'd add one last comment. John is just such an incredible advocate for this history, and I absolutely think there's more to be written. Not all has been written, as you just noted, Jessica. I think it's worth, this is maybe by way of comment, John, you don't need to respond, but it's probably worth you talking a bit more, writing a bit more about the sort of exceptionality of this photographic evidence, right? Placing it appropriately in context, and maybe a little bit more about the difficulty perhaps in gaining the sort of equipment and film that is necessary to document this very personal story of the famine in the way that your protagonist does. But as much as I sort of applaud the sentiment to move beyond the photograph, the photographer is central to this story, right? This father is photographing every aspect of these children's, of the lives of these children. And I guess that's where, sort of the impulse of my initial question is, they're cognizant of this, right? And that each phase of their life is being photographed, and their decisions to rebuke their father are also being marked by photographic evidence. That's a tremendous sort of display of power. And then it just strikes me, I mean, I'd be more interested in when I read more about this as you continue to work on it, what is absent to me. I mean, this is a very insular story, right? If this is an employed photographer, one would suggest that maybe to Mehmet's question, that he's photographing evidence of famine outside of the family. And if he's not doing so, then that suggests something about particular restrictions or his own sort of self-censorship, or simply, as you noted, perhaps the destruction of evidence by the GPU. So, you know, to the degree to which there is evidence of the world that exists outside of his family and neighbors interacting with this family, I think all that will lend to a much we'll be able to give you an opportunity to sort of generalize more what you're saying. Yeah, as a last note, I am struck as I listen to you, you know, how he's processing grief. You have some wonderful commentary on that, and we just don't have enough on that. You know, that coffee we had so long ago was really centered on that. You know, here we tend to focus immensely on the death, but not on those who are left behind to deal with the aftermath of death. But in the contemporary age, we have all sorts of grief counselors that are flown in, right, whenever we have a moment of trauma, and yet this man is processing his grief in his own particular way, which by nature of his own choices has to be closed, right? He has this sort of closed belief system which stands in opposition to the Soviet system around him, and is forced to process grief according to his own Tolstoyan beliefs that now have been marginalized and castigated. So this is all to say, I look forward to reading more, and I'm so grateful for the insight today, and I'm grateful for the Fulbright program for hosting such an event. So thank you, Jessica, and others. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, it's a lot to chew on, and you know, I'm sure that you will be able to provide me plenty of comments in the drafts that get sent to you, you know, in the near future. So thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful to hear and to engage. And also everyone out there, please know that you are invited also to share your research with us here at Fulbright. We're happy to host you, especially our alumni and current Fulbrighters most of all. Is there anybody else who has any closing burning questions they want to ask before we say goodbye to one another today? No? All right. So thank you again for joining us for this really significant and important discussion that we've had today. And John, especially, thank you for sharing your work. As it's evolving, it's always a treat to see the book before it's been published, growing into a book. And I also look forward to reading more of it. And I will see you later this week for our Thanksgiving celebration. Thank you all. Please have a safe and joyous holiday. Take care of yourselves, your friends, your families, and give thanks for what we do have.
Thanks very much.